A very good morning to all of you. You are warmly welcome to Chapter 2 of Upsurge, organized by the Student Circle of Economics and Decision Sciences. Upsurge is a webinar series which we initiated to redefine and uplift the economy. So through this webinar series, we are planning to talk about different economic topics which are really relatable to our lives. So today, the topic which we have selected is Sri Lankan economy way forward post-pandemic. So we invite all of you, if you have any further clarification to be made, you can use the chat box. So please feel free to use the chat box and direct your questions to us. Before moving on with our discussion, I would like to make this an opportunity to introduce y'all the guest speaker for the day. He is the chief economist at the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce and leads the Economic Intelligence Unit, which is the focal point of the Chamber for Economic Research and Policy Advocacy. He is engaged in providing policy-level support to the government to shape the national economic agenda. In his capacity as the chief economist of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, he is part of several steering committees formed by government to drive forward the economic agenda. He was previously a member of the steering committee on economic policy of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. He previously held the role as a lead economist and senior product head at Frontier Research, where he was responsible for the growth and strategic direction of the Economic Research Division. He has been part of numerous economic and business forums as a speaker, panelist, and a moderator. He is also a contributing writer to LMD's monthly Economic Outlook column. He was a co-author of the 60 Years of China-Sri Lanka Relations, a collaborative publication by the Embassy of the People's Republic of China in Sri Lanka and the Bandaranaike Center for International Studies. He is also an alumnus of the US International Visitor Leadership Program. And most importantly, he was also a guest speaker of the first chapter of our series, Upsurge, the economic forum organized by our university. So we would warmly welcome our guest speaker for the day, Mr. Shiran Fernando, the Chief Economist of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, for Chapter 2 of Upsurge. So, sir, we would like to know what your opinion about the timely topic which we have selected, the Sri Lankan economy way forward post-pandemic.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you to NSP, your department, for inviting me once again to be part of your webinar series. I'm glad that because of the current circumstances with COVID, it still hasn't hindered you all from having programs like this. I remember coming last year for the first time actually to NSPM, and it was really exciting for me, really coming there, seeing all your facilities, speaking to your staff as well as to the students, and engaging as well. It was really a good experience, and even at that point, my hope was that programs like this will really continue each year, where you'll have different speakers coming in. And I'm glad that despite the pandemic, you all are really having this even in a virtual environment, because I think there are pros and cons of learning in a virtual environment. But I think getting access to a lot of speakers, cutting down on travel time, being able to really connect, and I think also hopefully the participants, the students on the call today will also engage with asking questions as well, which sometimes maybe in a classroom environment, you might be a little scared, but here you can always type your questions on a chat box and send across. So I'm excited for the next 60 minutes or so, and let's see how this conversation goes, and hopefully I can provide you with a bit of knowledge from what I have, and maybe even learn from you all in terms of some of the questions and some of the way you all sort of view as you all are studying these various subjects as well.
Thank you so much, sir. So we have received so much of questions today. So we are trying to direct these questions to you, so it'll be beneficial for all of us. So the first question that I would like to direct you is, in Sri Lanka, how deep might the recession go? and what factors might affect the speed of the recovery?
Yeah, so that's a good question to really start off with, because if you look at what a recession is usually, it's when you know when in two consecutive quarters you have really growth being negative. That's what you call a technical recession. In Sri Lanka, most times, I think barring 2001, really hasn't seen recessionary conditions where growth has been below zero. And in 2020, when the pandemic hit, I think the first quarter, we did see a negative growth. And then in the following quarter as well, we did see. So technically, we did have a short dip into a recession. But in the third quarter, in the second half of 2020, we did see growth rebounding back to about 1.3% in each quarter. So it was a short-term dip into it. I think a lot of other countries, if you look at countries like even India, really saw in that second quarter, especially the April to June quarter last year, exactly 12 months before that quarter to this quarter, we really saw growth being even minus 20. A lot of the countries, but there has been a bounce back, and I think Sri Lanka has also shown that bounce back. For Sri Lanka, I think the main kind of I think on the growth path is really to see how we can now convert the 1 to 2%, 3% growth back to 4, 5, even 6% growth, because I think that's the key aspect that we need to really focus on. Because even before the pandemic, if you looked at our growth rates, and most of you might be looking at some of these growth rates, it was very below par than what we can actually perform. So we were around 2-3% in those years, and there were a lot of reasons: political instability. There were a lot of drought situations. There was flooding in certain years. Then, of course, in April 2019, the unfortunate events that took place as well. So a lot of these factors, drove growth. Was a drag on growth. And heading into 2020 pre-pandemic, the expectation was, with the new government, a lot of the tax incentives put in place as well, really growth will take off. But unfortunately, with the pandemic, it was stalled. So what we missed in 2020, I think now really needs to come in potentially in 2022. I think 2021, the indicators have been good so far in terms of economic activity has come through. The last 4 to 6 weeks where we've had the third wave taking place, I think we've had a bit of a setback, but not as bad as what we had 12 months ago or even during the second wave, because a lot of economic activity is still open despite a lot of the travel restrictions. We're having, a lot of our zones, industrial zones, taking place, at least on the manufacturing side. The services organizations have really adopted to working from home, so there's activity taking place there. And the agricultural side, I think, has got a bit more of a boost with the focus on agri. So it's shaping to positive. And I think if you answer your second question as into the speed of the recovery, it's really for these key segments of GDP, agri, industry, services. How do we really target to get growth back on track? So, for example, in agriculture, can we really keep the production going at a higher level? Can we get some of our tea and some of our other crops which we do produce? Can we keep the production level high? For industry, really, I think a lot of our manufacturing, because a lot of it revolves around apparel exports, which is about 5 billion in a good year, almost 40 to 50% of our total export basket. Our overseas markets are recovering. Europe and the US are doing much better. So there is orders coming in, but can we meet those orders because of the travel restrictions, the cases, especially within the zones? Can we really meet those things? So we might, see a bit of a dip in some of those performances. Services, on the other hand, I think barring things related to tourism, leisure, restaurants, food and things like that, which are taking a temporary dip, the other aspects can really recover. So this year, I think we'll expect growth to at least come to about 3-4%, and maybe hopefully by the end of this year, if a major portion of the population has been vaccinated, then even future waves might have less impact. And 2022 onwards, we can really see a proper recovery. So I think I went a bit in detail into your question, but I thought it'd be good to set context as we start the discussion.
Thank you, sir. So, yeah, how did the Sri Lankan banking sector react to the COVID-19 pandemic? That's our next question.
Yeah. So what we saw, what we saw globally, I think good to set the global context was especially March and April last year when this pandemic became a global pandemic. We saw really uh, the governments really stepping in and giving a lot of relief measures. Even for people who were losing jobs, who were relying on daily income, or firms who lost income because of the situation. So we really saw a lot of support, especially a lot of the developed countries and even countries like India being able to finance these. In Sri Lanka, it was a bit of it was a different this thing. Yes, we had the 5,000 rupees given to the low income household and also the Samudri beneficiaries, but beyond that, there wasn't too much of a relief. So that's where really the banking system had to come into play. The central bank really set up a COVID refinancing facility, which are two parts, I would say. There was a lot of debt moratoriums, which are basically relief on paying both the interest and principal, the capital, and more so, especially for the tourism sector, which was just recovering from the April 2019 attacks as well, and was bouncing back. They had a second hit with the pandemic. So we saw the moratoriums getting extended for them, and we saw moratoriums also being extended till the end of 2019, I think till about November, being extended for the rest of them as well. So there was relief on that side, and a special facility created by the central bank to give working capital at 4% interest rate to a lot of the businesses, which were finding it difficult to keep wages going because, for example, if you're a business in tourism, you're not getting income, but you have all this staff on your payroll, which you can't get rid of as well. So for that, I think there was a lot of working capital support that banking system, the central bank gave as a facility to the banks. I think central bank lent it to the banks at 2%, and the banks lent it to the customers at 4%. So initially, that took a while to get to the businesses. I think a lot of clarifications back and forth, a lot of information that maybe was not created as well. But then slowly, I think the banks picked it up, and now I think in excess of 150 billion has been given in terms of working capital to many sectors, and in particular the services sector, which is tourism. So that's, I think, how one way that the banking system is really supported. The other way has been the central bank, I think, has really reduced interest rates, and that's not something we've done alone. I think a lot of other countries as well have brought down the interest rates. Sri Lankan interest rates also are almost have been at a historic low in the last 6 to 8 months as well, and that is also to really facilitate more lending. And now we're seeing slowly the signs of more lending taking place. There are more what we call credit to private sector. That's a key figure that we look at when we analyze macro data. That number is now picking up. In March, it was around 112 billion in terms of a monthly growth of credit that the private sector banks were or the commercial banks were giving to the private sector. So those signs, I think the bank, just to sum up, I think the banking system has been a crucial part of this recovery process and also the relief process. And I think there is still a lot more to do, which the banks will have to get involved with.
So the next question is what is the impact on the capital market, and what is the reason behind the high performance of the share market during COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, so the capital market, I think if you jog your memory back to about 12 months ago, we did see the market was closed initially because with the travel restrictions, the curfew at that time, was very difficult, I think, for the market to open because everything was geared to a physical presence and a physical transactions taking place. So till about, I think, May, really the market didn't open, and whenever it did during certain periods of time, it just crashed because there was a lot of uncertainty. Uncertainty as to where COVID was going, what it will mean for the listed companies, which what it will mean for their earnings, because some of them were really seeing negativity in that aspect. So a lot of this uncertainty, and also people were also wanting to hold on to cash because it was an uncertain period of time. So people were selling naturally as well. So all these factors initially, I think, saw the market, dipping below the 5,000 levels and sort of reaching some lows. But I think once the automation took place, the digitization took place, and the market was then kept open, we saw recovery, and recovery has been fueled by, I think, expectations for greater earnings. Also, the valuations, if you look at, so one of the things that people, investors look at is valuations, and with the market falling so much, the share price had gone, a lot of the company's share price had gone down below what we call the net book value. So I think there was a lot of investors who saw opportunity, and with the low interest rates also taking place, low interest rates, people were, having their fixed deposits maturing towards the end of the year and realizing, oh, what I had around 10-14% earlier is now 6-7%. So people, who depend on interest income suddenly would be of the view of, now I need high return, and some of those came into the stock market as well. And I think all that interest really saw retail investors coming into play, some of what we call the institutional investors, the banks, the high net worth individuals coming into play. And coupled with, I think, the recovery in earnings we've seen. And if you open up the daily FT paper today and even yesterday, you'll see how good the earnings have been in the last quarter, and the recovery. A lot of them are recording highest earnings ever. Companies like LOLC, which have done really well, other companies, consolidated companies, which have also recovered. So all of those are what is really driving the market, and I think that's kind of what's taking place. And also on the capital market side, I must say the Securities and Exchange Commission as well as the CSC have used this period to really drive a few key digitization reforms and some other reforms to facilitate investment. So I think some of those factors are highlighted in some of the news reports that they put out. And so a combination of these factors, I would say, have really supported the market at this point.
So has Sri Lanka already implemented satisfactory policies to survive under COVID-19?
So if you look at what you mean by satisfactory policies, I think the biggest I think the caveat or the limitation you can put is there is no single strategy that has worked. I think different countries have benefited from different strategies. So if you look at New Zealand, really the strategy was to be very aggressive earlier on and really eliminate. They took in the harsh restrictions, and now they're benefiting from really not having any COVID cases for a long time now. Maybe a few clusters here and there. So that's one of the signs that we've seen. If you look at other countries, like say for example the US, we really saw them really struggling earlier on, and a lot of the cases, and I think that was during the Trump presidency. They were not really taking it seriously and not really heeding to what was required. So we saw a lot of cases going on, and then after that, post the Biden administration, really a more concerted effort, and now you really see their numbers going down. Other countries like India did really well, but now are really going through a bad phase with the third wave, and some other South Asian countries as well. So it's a mixed bag. I think there is no perfect recipe of what's a good playbook. Initially, the debate was lives versus livelihood, because people's lives are really important, and you need to really be able to guard against this pandemic. And there is a lot of people who really rely on daily wage income, who really rely on daily economic activity to make ends meet. So you have the livelihood aspect as well. So I think right now the tendency is to somehow balance the both. And that's why even right now I think we are having these health restrictions, but the ability for a lot of these economic activities to take place with all the safety precautions in place. So it's a learning process. I think the government has also learned how to deal with it and is managing it. And from the private sector point of view, also it has been really adapting to every wave, because the first wave was completely different. Everything was just at a standstill. The second wave, you were not really sure, are we going to go for a full lockdown or things like that? But continuity was there. And this lockdown it sort of shows how economic activity can still continue. So I think there's an adjustment process taking place, and I think that's happening very comfortably, not comfortably, but happening at a certain pace. And I think what we really need to roll out much quicker, I think, is the vaccine process, because I think that will be a key part to sort of contain the next strain, because the next strain could be a different variant, and we're also too early on with some of the vaccines to see whether they are combating some of the other variants. So um, those are the things that we need to really think into the future, so that in 6 months' time as well, we are ready for to face another outbreak or to face another wave.
So, could the pandemic create opportunities for other industries to rise in importance for the Sri Lankan economy and replace industries such as textiles, tea, and tourism? I think we talked about this to a certain extent in the first question also. So, yeah, we would like to know your opinion about this.
Which were the two countries? Which were the two sectors you said?
Textiles, tea, and tourism.
Okay. So when we look at, I think textiles I covered to a certain aspect. I think if you look at textiles, just to add to it, I think countries like Vietnam, which have been able to mitigate the cases, have also attracted a lot of investment, and also a lot of the orders as well. Because what's also taking place globally is what we call this supply chain shift, where countries now do not want to rely, and this is what COVID has also taught, and I think the US-China trade war, all of those combinations have really taught companies maybe not to have too much of emphasis in one market or too much of production in one market. A lot of countries are now adopting what you call the China plus one strategy, where you have your production facilities in China, but can you also have something in a country like Vietnam? So that's taking place as well. So from that point of view, Vietnam has really benefited. Sri Lanka to a certain extent, but it's really about managing our cases, and that's a big opportunity for us. On tea, I think, especially initially on, because the agricultural side of the economy was still open even in the first wave, whereas key countries like Kenya and India were closed, Sri Lanka was able to export and do well in that period. But now things have changed a bit, and I think for us more it's the issues of the domestic production and productivity rather than what's going on externally. Externally as well, I think the demand for tea and especially green tea and the concept of tea, I think has advanced because of COVID and the health aspects of it as well. So that has been positive. Your third sector was?
Tourism and textiles. So tea and
Okay, so yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so for tourism, I would say clearly the situation has not been ideal. But we did see briefly between the end of the second wave till I think about March, April, a little bit of a bounce back. We saw tourists coming back. We've seen countries like Maldives doing much better because it's pretty much island nations, and they're able to segregate. And Sri Lanka also has companies which have resorts there. So if you look at John Keel's, the cinnamon brand has resorts there. If you look at Akin Spence, they have resorts there. So indirectly, Sri Lankan companies have benefited with tourism resuming in countries like Maldives. Other countries have created things like bio bubbles and safety bubbles, and I think we've also tried to create like a tourism bubble where tourists go to only certain locations and there's no real interaction. But I think right now with the third wave, especially with the strain, which is quite rampant and dangerous as well, I think we will have to be careful when opening up. I think a couple of days, once again, we opened up and we've had about 19 tourists coming in. The numbers, I think, will trickle in. Maybe the full recovery will be really next year. But if you look at our key markets like Europe, UK, they're doing much better. People want to travel, so the appetite will be there. There's also what we call pent-up demand because people have been just stuck. If you look at UK, one of our key markets, people have been stuck in their homes. What we are having right now, being stuck in our homes with the travel restrictions the UK market had during Christmas time. So you can imagine the frustration and the lack of travel and the need for travel right now from a lot of them as well. So that's something we can capture, but we need our cases to come down, and we need to be doing much better. So I think there is optimism for tourism to recover very quickly, but it really requires the cases to come down.
What will happen for the future tourism sector? That was a question that most of the people have. So, are there any solutions to overcome this crisis regarding the tourism sector?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a um, difficult situation right now to really promote the country and also promote tourists to come. Um, but as I mentioned, I think it's really identifying key markets which have demand, and then seeing can we have a proper bubble or some concept where they'll come here. We can also try getting long haul tourists where they don't really come for a day or two, but really look to spend 10 days, for example. So we don't really focus on the numbers, but on the value. If they come for 10 days, will they be able to spend as much as someone as much as they're getting more numbers? So I think that's where we will really have to focus, and also on the product. What can Sri Lanka offer more than what it's known for in terms of the beaches and the cultural aspect of it? How can we package it a bit better? So I think those are some of the key elements. And I think one thing that the industry has always been talking about is this marketing campaign, which will really highlight us. I think sometimes we see a bit of it online, but I think really focusing on key channels, maybe be CNN or BBC, or really targeting some of these global media networks to get the message out there. Because uh, when you compete with similar offerings like beaches, there are a lot of others that are in that same market. So can we really have something that will stand out as well? And also, I think the unique thing for Sri Lanka is the wellness aspect. Given rich heritage in Ayurveda and that heritage which is now passed on, can we really focus on wellness, which is also now getting a bit more prominent with COVID, and the need to take better care of yourself and also mental health and all those aspects coming in. So there are opportunities. I think there are opportunities popping up. In the short term, not too great for tourism, but in the medium to long term, I think there is the potential to do much better.
So now we would like to give the chance to the attendees. If you have any question, you can direct to us. So we can see some questions in the chat box. Before reading out them, I would like to know whether there are undergraduates who would like to unmute their mic and direct the question.
The first question is usually the hardest, and then and then it becomes a bit difficult after that.
I have a question, sir. What will be the impact of government borrowing from China and Bangladesh during this pandemic situation?
Sure, that's a great question. Is it Hansi?
Yes.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay. Hi, Hansi. Great question. So that's one aspect I couldn't really touch upon, which is our debt situation. Thanks for bringing up that question. Um, I think pre-pandemic as well, the situation was known to everyone that we had about 4 billion plus, 4 USD billion plus every year to really refinance. And those were a lot of our international sovereign bonds that we had borrowed in the past, plus our borrowings from other multilateral agencies or project loans, things like that, which now came up for repayment. And last year, this year, and going forward till about 23, 24, that 4 billion is continuing. So that was well known by a lot of the international rating agencies and also the investors. And with COVID and what happened, I think a lot of the rating agencies took the view that with this debt overhang, as we call it, plus the pandemic situation, it'll become very difficult for Sri Lanka to raise overseas borrowing. And we got downgraded. And I think by Fitch, by S&P ratings, and Moody's as well. And now we're kind of at the lowest rating on the investment grade rating, and all at a similar level. So with that, it really cut off our access to going out and raising international sovereign bonds, because if you look at US dollar bond, which is maturing in 2030, for most periods last year and even till about a few weeks back, it was close to 15 to 20% in terms of yield, which is very high. So if you were to go out into the market again at our current rating, we'll have to raise it at that higher rate. And the government's policy also is not to pursue arrangement with the IMF because of the conditionalities and some of the issues related to that. So their strategy, I think, is really to rely on aid and also the loans and swap facilities from countries like China, India, Bangladesh. Now they've engaged even the Middle Eastern banks, Japan, and also to get more project type facilities from the multilateral agencies like ADB, World Bank. So if you look at the Bangladesh arrangement, that is another swap facility where we will get 200 million US dollars, and that will help our trade kind of influence balance. The swap with China is also similar in that arrangement, 1.5 billion, which will support our imports from China, because if you look at our import basket, we rely on imports from China and India, and that's on a good year around 4 billion US dollars. So that 1.5 billion will sort of help support that as well. So all these measures, I think, are really to improve reserves in the short term, and also improve the dollar liquidity, because that's a key impact. So you don't want the rupee to depreciate. I think the rupee depreciation has been a lot due to this lack of dollar liquidity and concerns on the overall US dollar position. So we've had to rely on these measures, and I think more of those will sort of pan out. And I think the more we get, the more confidence the market has, and you're seeing that with some of the US dollar bond yields now have come down as well. So it's a slow process where we can, convince the investors and the international markets that there is a plan to repay these debts, and arranging whether it's Bangladesh or be it China, be it the Reserve Bank of India, and even Middle Eastern banks or funds. I think that is the process that the government is really looking to do without pursuing an IMF program. I hope that answered the question, but I thought I'll give a bit of context because I didn't really cover the debt situation.
Yes, sir.
Do we have any more questions?
Excuse me, sir, I have a question.
So how can we create new opportunities and expand the economy in Sri Lanka during this post COVID-19?
Sorry, I didn't hear the second part of your question.
How can we create new opportunities and expand the economy in Sri Lanka during this post COVID-19?
Sure. So there are things like, as I mentioned, even in tourism, there are things like wellness coming up. So that's an area. There is a real focus by government, even in its policy to promote agriculture. So there's a lot of opportunities really coming up there, because if you look at agriculture, we have about 25% of the labor force in agriculture, but it only contributes about 7% to overall GDP. So there's a bit of a mismatch there. So how can we really get more value out of agriculture? And that's where value adding, which are doing things in raw form, comes into play. So I think there's a real thrust towards those areas. Then the government is also looking at organic farming, sustainable farming. So those aspects are also really coming out at the moment as well. So that's kind of a bright spot. The other one, as I mentioned, in manufacturing really is areas like pharmaceuticals. Health sector has really got priority, and I think COVID situation has really highlighted how much maybe we need to be more secure on the pharma aspect of it, to ensure that there is enough production of key medicines and key tablets and things like that. So I think there's a real thrust towards that area as well. Of course, we need foreign investment. There is a lot of technology transfer that needs to come in. So that's an area I think the government is also really looking at. And overall, I think there is opportunities now coming out in logistics as well, because of the pandemic, because of how consumers are changing. Like you and I working from home might not necessarily now want to go into the supermarket or the polo or whatever. We can maybe get some of these goods back home. So a lot of these supply chains really have to adjust and reorient themselves. So that's opportunity for new players to come in, new e-commerce channels to come in. So I think there's a lot of these opportunities coming up in different spaces. And for I think us, and I think as you all also looking at what sectors to really work in, could even consider the path of being an entrepreneur, because I think that's something that's really being supported right now. Of course, there's a lot of pitfalls, there's a lot of issues, a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of things that you need to stumble upon, but I think opportunities are opening up. And I think another area that is really opening up is the IT BPM side of it, where because of the pandemic, a lot more globally, a lot of the global companies are really looking to automate. They're looking to change their services, their products, and they need a destination that can do that. And I think Sri Lanka is one of those destinations because of our good product companies and service companies in the IT BPM field. So that's an area that's really coming up. And within that, I mean, it's not only just engineers, but you need people, even business analysts, to really think through how to cater towards a change or a product. So just don't think of it as coding, but there's a lot more professions within that when we mean IT BPM as well. So those are just a few areas I'll leave you with.
Thank you, sir.
So we can give another opportunity to someone who has a question. So are there any questions more?
Hi, sir. I have a question. So how much time would you assume for our economy to recover as previously?
Yeah. Is it Moveen?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Hi, Moveen. So if you look at what we mean by previously, and that's what I sort of talked about even at the start, 2019, I think we were still, below our economic potential and growth potential. So there is a little bit more that we can grow beyond that. So this year, I think we can go back to even what we were pre-pandemic. We can go back to that growth level. But to really see us going back to 4, 5, 6% is really going to be our challenge, I think. And I think that's where really not having, future waves coming and disrupting economic activity, getting tourism back on track and starting it, those are the key challenges really to take us back. And I think that could be maybe next year, hopefully, or even 2023, where we really go back to 4, 5, 6% level of growth. Uh, it depends on two factors: future outbreaks, and also how well the vaccination, I think, process takes place, and also how well our overseas markets do. Because right now, our exports are doing pretty okay and pretty stable, because our external markets are doing much better than what people thought they would be doing. Because if you look at our apparel exports, they're really dependent on 5, 6 main brands. And if those brands aren't performing in those key markets, then we get impacted. But luckily, they've adopted even to the work from home environment. They've created new products which are now being produced in our factories here and being designed here as well. So it's a mixture of these three factors, I think, that will really set the pace for our recovery.
Thank you, sir.
Do we have any more questions?
Yes, I have a question, sir. The question is, will we see an economic depression in the near future?
So I think we started with the whole recession aspect as well. Depression is a bit more different, where it's almost a prolonged period of growth being really subdued. If you look at the economic history of it, I think 1930s we did see that taking place. 2009, with the global financial crisis, some of the countries went into a depression. Here at the start of the pandemic, we thought we could be heading into those kind of periods, but because of how quickly a lot of the global pharmaceutical companies collaborated and put out the vaccines, things got a bit better. So I wouldn't think we go into a depression situation. You can't rule it out. I think the pandemic has taught, if one thing the pandemic has taught is never to rule out any scenario. But given how quickly the vaccination process is taking place globally and even in Sri Lanka, and depends on the future strains as well, I don't think we will really head into a depression kind of a situation. Sri Lanka really needs to maybe manage its external debt situation a bit better to avoid any spillover from that to the economy and the private sector. So I think that's the two key challenges for us at the moment. But right now, I would say depression conditions is something to worry about. But that's an interesting question from a risk perspective.
Thank you, sir.
Do we have any more questions? So if not, we would like to move on to the chat box. So we have few questions in the chat box too. One question is, what is happening with the cryptocurrency, and are they in connection with this pandemic?
Yeah, so if you look at cryptocurrency, I mean, I would first put a disclaimer that I'm no expert on it, or not something I've really been studying or learning, but just curiosity, reading the news is similar to y'all as to what's going on there. So it's this whole concept of decentralization, right? Where previously currently you have all these central banks controlling currency movements and the banking system really facilitating that, and cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin and all of the other Ethereum and all the others are part of that process to decentralize. It has its pros and cons, and I think what we're really seeing is a lot of interest towards the technology, and a lot of speculation over the technology. I think those are the two aspects of it. So you're seeing, um, uh, big investors like the investor in like a Tesla founder sort of backing certain currencies as well. That then causes sudden spike in the share price. And the next day, another news coming out, and then the price going down. So it's very, I would say, very volatile. Central bank itself does not really endorse trading in cryptocurrencies because I think of the high level of volatility. But that's something a lot of people now are going into because of the depreciating currency and what's going on as well. But I think there's a lot more in that. It's a technology that you can't discard. I think it will be there. It'll evolve and maybe become mainstream more. But I think there's a maturity stage which needs to go through to avoid these sharp rises and falls. So that's how I sort of how I view it.
Okay. In your opinion, sir, what type of regulatory support can be given by the side of the government, central bank, and treasury to help upcoming businesses which can contribute to the growth and sustainability of the Sri Lankan economy?
Great. So that's a really good question. So I think that's questions around deregulation and really improving the ease of doing business. So if you look at ease of doing business, where we rank right now is 99th position. We were historically, doing a bit much more better than that. We've come down over the last few years. Last year, I think we came up about 8 places. And if you look at where some of the factors where we don't really do well is things like enforcing contracts, things to do with taxes and also the approval processes. So I think with those in mind, what we really have seen taking place at the start of this year was the president setting up a deregulation commission. And that is co-chaired by the principal advisor to the president, as well as a person from the private sector. The chairman of John Keel's Holdings is also on the board of the Ceylon Chamber as well. So a private sector, public sector task force to really look at how to, look at deregulation and what are the key areas that are being bottlenecks for entrepreneurs, for businesses. And I think right now, I think they've, compiled kind of an initial report, and I think look for a 3-month extension because there's been so much of submissions that have gone to them, and they really need to study all the processes. Because over time, different ministries, different institutions have put on ad hoc regulations which are still being followed, which doesn't make any sense, especially for an entrepreneur. So I think that process hopefully will bear fruit. We'll see some real impacts and real cut downs. So for example, where you need to get a license, you don't really need to go to the Grama Sevaka, the district secretary, and then to the EDB, say, for example, if you're exporting. So can all those be done in one process? But the 17-step process can be reduced to 5-6 processes. So I think that's what businesses really need. That's what entrepreneurs also really need. And hopefully, I would say this commission will deliver it. And there's also a push to really look at the ease of doing business aspect as well. Things like arbitration to really improve with the contract side of it. So steps have been taken on both sides. I think it's just the pandemic has really caused those to be kind of backstories and in the limelight, not in the limelight. But hopefully, as we overcome this pandemic, those issues will surface and we'll be able to tackle them. And I think ease the cost of doing business as well, because we need to be creating more and more entrepreneurs who want to do things differently, who want to create new things, because that's how economies really have done well, where we've really created things, we've captured that value in Sri Lanka, in our own country, and we're able to benefit from it. So right now, these factors are not taking place the way it should be.
So we talked about the agricultural system to a certain extent. So there's another question on it. Is it possible to our agriculture system to survive on this pandemic?
I think the pandemic has really reinforced the agriculture system and reinforced being sustainable in certain crops, even like rice and even other crops that we're looking at. And I think the government has prioritized about 7, 8 crops as well. It's also really looked at even things like the poultry market, the dairy market, all of that, all those different subsegments within agriculture. So I think it has, in a good way, it's been a positive for the agriculture sector. There's been more emphasis on it. Where we need to go forward is that value add component, because can the farmers, do a little bit more value add and be able to sell into the market without, selling it to the intermediary who, really benefits, and the farmer doesn't really benefit from their harvest. So can we get that information and technology to the farmers to do exactly that and be able to go to market? So I think those are the key elements that we really need to look at the moment. But I think it's overall been a positive for the sector.
So what are the strategies that the Sri Lankan government has implemented to recover the currency depreciation?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I think so. If you look at this year, if you look at last year, I would say let's look at last year where the pandemic hit. We did see in April the rupee hitting 200 initially. It just went suddenly overnight and hit 200, and then it's recovered back to 185, 187. I'm talking about the spot, the USD spot, and the US dollar also didn't do too. It wasn't adding pressure, and even despite the pandemic, despite the downgrade, we only saw limited depreciation. It was supported also by a lot of the import restrictions. I think we saw a 2 billion fall in imports last year. Oil prices were low. So all these factors really kept the rupee in check despite we were going in a pandemic. And I think we only depreciated about 2-3%. My memory fails me on the annual average depreciation, but I'm feeling it's around that amount. But this year it's been a bit different. This year, a lot of these factors have gone the other way. The US dollar has strengthened because of, post the Biden presidency, economic activity has picked up, labor market has picked up, so the dollar has got strengthened. So when the dollar strengthens, the currency that is referenced against it will naturally depreciate because, our rupee is priced against the dollar strengthens, there's pressure on the LKR. Plus, I think concerns about our reserve position, our ability to refinance, a lot of that has put a bit of pressure from a behavioral point of view. Because I think one thing, my key message is a lot of our markets in Sri Lanka is really driven by behavior. There's fundamentals on one side, you can look at a balance of payments, you can look at trade position, you can do forecasts. But really what matters is the behavioral aspect, how the marketplace think on a particular day, how they think of trading, things like that. That's what really impacts, and how businesses feel about this, how they feel about the next week, the next month, the next order. Those really drive markets. So even from that perspective, the rupee has been under pressure. So January was a very volatile month. Then February we saw stability. Then March we saw a bit of stability, and then April once again volatility, and May has been very stable and under 200, under 200. So it's been an overall very volatile period for the currency. A lot of factors driving it, as I mentioned. Excuse me. But I think one thing we really need to look at is in the next 6 months, especially on the 1st of July, we have a $1 billion bond that is coming up for refinancing. Once we get over that hurdle and we set out a roadmap of how we're going to refinance, plus we get more of these swaps arrangements, some of these loan arrangements in place, I think a bit more confidence will come to the market and we'll really see the rupee stabilizing. That's one scenario. I think the other scenario is really things getting a bit more worse. We don't get the inflows that we want. imports getting higher. We're already seeing oil prices now back above what it was during the pandemic, pre-pandemic. It's close to about $70 a barrel. So if those factors get really worse and out of our control, then there will be pressure on the rupee to go even beyond 200. So a lot of factors either way, and I think that's an important part when you're if you want to study economics and even be in this trade, is really to understand all these factors and how it can play out. And I think it's very intuitive in certain sense, but and it's also really behavioral driven as well. So I don't know if you all have any subjects with behavioral economics or even things with psychology, because it's pretty much that sometimes which drive markets, the psychology. And sometimes you hear calls from importers, exporters, bankers, which really dictate where the rupee sometimes goes.
So what are the impacts you see from the rising unemployment rates in Sri Lanka towards the Sri Lankan economy?
Sure. So if you look at the unemployment rate, I think we were around 4% pre-pandemic. That has gone above, I think, 5%, with about, I think, 300 or 400,000 increase in unemployment, if I'm not mistaken, from the numbers I remember. I think a lot of that is a bit on the short-term side as well, because a lot of part-time workers, contract workers initially did lose a lot of jobs. Some of them have migrated. Those who have come into cities have gone back to, say, the villages and got into agriculture. So maybe some of that is not being captured by the data. So I think it'll be a short-term phenomenon. What is more, I think, concerning is can we really create new jobs? So for you all even entering the workforce, what will be the new jobs that will be created post-pandemic? Will a lot of the private sector firms be hiring very actively? And what sectors will be doing that? So I think those are the key questions that we really need to look at. And on the unemployment side, more on the daily wage side, I think really how can the government really support some of them so that they don't fall out of the labor force and completely disappear from the labor force, but stay intact. And the other aspect of it is also, I think, the labor force is with the remittances, because we've seen really, especially last year and this year, workers returning back to Sri Lanka. That's a big part of the whole thing. And not as much departures, because if you look at the annual report of the central bank, you look at the appendices, you will see a figure in one of the tables called departures for foreign employment, and you'll see in the last 10 years or so, every year we've had 200,000, close to 300,000 in certain years departing. But last year I think it was only about 40 or 50,000, and I don't think that number might go even higher this year as well. So there's A, returnees, and also B, people who are not able to go overseas for employment as well. So how can we really integrate them into the labor force and ensure that they are in some productive employment as well? So it's a difficult situation, I think, on the labor force side at the moment.
Thank you so much, sir. So we think we could clarify many of the doubts that our undergraduates had regarding this topic, the Sri Lankan economy and the way forward post-pandemic. So I would like to make this an opportunity to thank Mr. Shiran Fernando, the Chief Economist of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, for sharing your valuable knowledge with us and for being a part of the Chapter 2 of Upsurge. Thank you so much, sir. And also, we would like to thank all of you for joining with us to share this knowledgeable experience with us. So we would like to invite all of you to join our next sessions too. So COVID-19 is a challenge to all of us, but I think identifying the opportunities among those challenges would be the real success. So we are hoping to meet you again with another informative session like this. Till then, stay safe and take care. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Andrea, and thank you to the team for inviting me. And I'm glad that a lot of questions came in directly, and we were able to engage with the students. Have a great day and stay safe.
Thank you so much, sir.